Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. If you'd like to take your seats now, and we'll get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this third Romanian Business and Investment Summit organized by Economist Impact. It's great to be back in Bucharest. We've got a really great program for everybody today, some really good panels and speakers. Just to introduce myself, my name is Joan Hoey. I'm the director for the Economist Democracy Index, former director for Europe at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm your co-chairperson today, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mario Bikarski, my co-chairperson. Mario is on the Eastern Europe desk in the Country Analysis and Forecasting Division at the EIU, Economist Intelligence Unit, covering Ukraine, Russia, and various other countries in this region. Before we get into our first panel, which is looking at the energy crisis, I thought it would be useful for everybody to give you a few numbers, to give you very briefly the Economist's forecast for the global economy, for Europe, for Romania and Southeast Europe. So we're going to have a very quick conversation, about 5 minutes, and then we'll start our first panel. So, Mario, maybe we can start by, if I can ask you, what is the EIU forecast for the global economy this year? Just a few numbers, maybe to tell us the kind of headline, real GDP growth figure, and inflation.
Yes, so EIU expects global economic growth to slow markedly in 2023, reflecting persistent headwinds arising from the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine and also elevated global inflation and global monetary tightening. We forecast that global growth will stand at 2% this year. And if we look at the major economic blocks, in both the US and the EU, growth will be at 0.7%, so quite lackluster, while in China, growth will be quite robust at 5.7%. Global energy prices will remain elevated, which will keep inflation high. We're forecasting oil prices to remain at around $87 per barrel in 2023 and above 80 until 2025.
Great. So what about Europe? Because that's the region, of course, that's been most exposed to negative fallout from the war in Ukraine. What are we expecting for the whole region?
So the outlook for Europe is now looking more positively than maybe 6 months ago. Europe will now avoid a recession. We don't expect a recession in neither the EU nor the Eurozone. But monetary tightening and high inflation will remain drags on growth. We expect the European Central Bank to continue with its tightening cycle, and we expect that short-term interest rates will settle between 3.5% and 4% by mid-year. However, now given what's been happening in the United States with the failure of these banks, the European Central Bank appears to be paying more attention to the banking sector, and there is a risk now that they will actually stop their tightening cycle in March, not to cause a crisis in Europe's banking sector.
Yes, so I'm sure we'll come back to what's happening in the banking sector, but I guess just quickly to ask you, are you relatively sanguine about the fallout from that it can be contained in Europe?
I believe so. I'm positive that Europe will not face significant pressure arising from that, but the role of the European Central Bank will be to continue closely monitoring these particular banks that are at risk.
Thanks. So before we look at Romania and this region, what's the forecast for the war in Ukraine? How do we see that progressing this year? So
we expect the war in Ukraine to be a protracted conflict. In this year, we expect to see the high-intensity conflict that we have seen so far continue. Western arms deliveries to Ukraine will prevent Russia from achieving its strategic objectives on the ground, but it will be a very, very difficult path ahead. Russia-West relations will continue to be ruptured. Sanctions will continue to be applied, extended, and the controls for these sanctions to be tightened. And going forward, we expect to see, as both sides become more and more exhausted and the costs, humanitarian and economic, of the war mount on both Ukraine and Russia, the intensity of the conflict to gradually decline as we move towards the midterm.
Okay, thanks. So what about Romania and Southeast Europe?
So the outlook for Romania and Southeast Europe is not too dissimilar to that for Europe as a whole. We still expect economic growth to slow this year. In Romania, we forecast a real GDP growth of 2.4% compared with last year's very good numbers of 4.8%. Inflation has peaked and it is slowing, but it will still remain significantly elevated than the historic trends before the pandemic, for example. What Southeast Europe managed to do really well last year was to diversify its energy supply, to really adjust to this new reality of no Russian energy, no Russian natural gas or oil, and they have done really well in that respect. But we see that other aspects, such as high food prices, that are really dragging households' spending.
Great. Well, maybe on that note, talking about energy, we can move to the first panel discussion of the day. So thanks very much, Mario, and we'll see you back on stage in a few moments. So hopefully that was a bit helpful in terms of setting the scene for what to expect overall in terms of global growth and inflation in 2023. So the big topic, obviously, is this ongoing energy crisis and what it means for the green transition. So that's the subject of our first session, Mitigating the Energy Crisis, Redesigning the Green Transition.